Hello, my name is Luke Johnson. I am a lecturer in creative writing at the University of Wollongong, short story writer, and I'm coming at you today from my home in Kirraville, which is located on Darrawell country, just a couple of kilometres west of Wollongong. I'm going to be talking to you today about the craft of short story writing. The aim here being to set you up to go away and write a short story of your own. Take for granted that most of you will have read a short story, if not all of you, and that many of you may have even tried writing a short story before. So my aim here is not so much to introduce short stories as to get you thinking about the mechanics of short stories, what needs to go into the process that involved in writing one. And I intend on doing this by fleshing out what I would consider to be 5 fairly elementary components of the short story form, which can be captured in one pithy sentence. Once upon a time, something happened to somebody. As an archetype, as a structural blueprint, that sentence has everything needed to make a short story. It's got an event, the something. It's got a character, which should be the somebody. It's got a sense of perspective, which is to say that we know it's a third-person past tense narrator. Once upon a time, something happened to somebody. It's got a sense of setting. That would be the once upon a time. And there's also a trace of a kind of quite a particular sort of voice coming through early on as well. With once upon a time, you get a pretty clear sense of the sort of reader that this story is courting. It's got a fairy tale-esque tone, right? So these are 5 things, event, character, setting, perspective, and voice, that you need to be thinking about really early on in the short story writing process. If not before you put any words on the page, then I would say as you're putting those first words on the page. That's how fundamental these aspects are, these 5 parts. So this is the terrain that I want to cover today, and I've got a number of activities that I want you guys to be doing as I make my way through this. So I'll be asking you from time to time to stop the video, to pause the video, and to try your hand at completing some of the tasks. So the first thing that I'm going to ask you to do is get you to think about your pithy synopsis, your one-sentence synopsis for the story you're going to write. You may have no idea at this stage what that is, so this is what I'm asking. I'm asking you to pause the video and to spend some time coming up with maybe half a dozen possible story ideas. Oh, sorry, I can see the sun coming in there. I'll move my screen. A number of story ideas that you might be able to work on. So the aim here is that by the end of this half an hour session, you're going to have maybe you're going to have the foundations or the basis for a half-decent short story that you can go away and continue working on. Now, when I was thinking about this seminar, I went looking through my shelf and picked up a number of short story collections to see just how doable this was, how easy it was to reduce a good short story to a single sentence. And I came across a number of short story writers whom I admire quite a lot, and opened up their collections and looked for the story that sort of stuck out to me. And I think it is kind of doable in a lot of instances. There's a story in John McGregor's collection, This Isn't the Sort of Thing That Happens to Someone Like You, which I think is a great collection, that can be summarized as once upon a time a father was arrested after showing up and causing a scene at his daughter's school nativity pageant. Or A.M. Holmes's collection, The Safety of Objects, has a story in it called A Real Doll, which can be summarized once upon a time a pubescent boy starts dating his sister's Barbie doll. Or Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's The Thing Around Your Neck. Once upon a time, a girl's brother was sent to a mysterious Nigerian prison after being accused of gang involvement. Or anyone that's checked out Edgar Corret's most recent collection, Fly, already, will know there's a little 2-page story in there which perhaps can be summarized by saying that once upon a time a goldfish got out of its bowl in the middle of the night to watch the family TV. So obviously there's a lot more going on in those stories than I've just indicated in my reductive synopsis. Nevertheless, this is the essence of those stories. They can be whittled down to this kind of core event, or this kind of pithy archetype, and that's what I want you guys to do. And I'm going to be working on one alongside you. You know those cooking shows where the chef pulls something out of the oven and says, "This is one that I prepared earlier"? Well, I'm going to be working with a story that I prepared earlier. And the tagline for my story, if you like, is that once upon a time, a young boy witnessed his father get into a drunken altercation on grand final day. So as we make our way through the seminar over the next half hour, I'm going to begin building on my idea, and I'm going to ask you guys to begin building on your idea. And that's what you need to do now. You need to pause the video, and you need to turn it back on when you've got an idea that is can be clearly stated in one sentence, that is roughly the equivalent of "once upon a time something happened to somebody." Okay, hopefully you're back, and you've got your sentence, you've got your rough idea, and you're ready to begin working on it. So the first thing we're going to do, or the first thing I'm going to ask, is that you start thinking about expanding this event. You should have a core event. Mine is a boy witnessing his father get into a drunken altercation. And in order to expand this event, the first thing you need to do is realize that this event has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And this is true not just of events, but of actions in general, right? Like, it doesn't matter what you do, there's before you did it, there's as you're doing it, and then there's the consequences that result from you having done it, whether it's something as simple as picking up a glass of water to take a drink, or whether it's something as ugly as a father getting into a drunken altercation on grand final day in front of his son. They can be reduced to these kind of three parts. And if you've done a little bit of looking at story theory in the past, you'll be familiar with the three-act structure. So that's roughly what we're trying to mine here. So I want you to be thinking about your event as in, what is the very early part of the event? What is the beginning of the event? Where does it start? Now, for a short story, you're usually trying to start your story as late in the piece as possible, which means getting rid of all the superfluous information that you might be tempted to jam in there early on. In my experience of reading a lot of short stories that come to me by way of students, that superfluous information usually begins with somebody waking up in bed in the morning and fumbling for an alarm clock, and quite often there are dust motes floating around in the air, and there is sunlight coming in through the crack in the blinds, like trying to figure out, like that sunlight over there coming in through my blinds. That's superfluous. That's actually not that interesting to a reader, and it's probably not that important to your story. What you're looking for here actually is the moment at which your story, which your event, I should say, begins. The moment at which all of the train of action has started, the wheels have started turning, and there's no stopping it. So with my story, I'm going to begin. Oh, the other thing I should say is that you're also looking for a moment that is just before the most, you know, the real action kicks into gear, because you want to give your reader a sense of what life is like for your character just before this kicks into gear, what normal looks like for them, because your event is almost necessarily going to interrupt this sense of normal. So the reader won't know if there's been an interruption unless they've been able to see normal and then witnessed it be interrupted. And there are some crafty ways of playing around with this that various writers use. But at this stage, we're just thinking quite chronologically about this. So we want to see your character walking down the street, having a normal walk, and then the event happens really quickly and it starts escalating from there. What else do I need to say about events? That you should be trying to ensure that the event follows a line that looks a little bit like this, that the action is rising, that the story is becoming more and more tense, more and more dramatic, more and more interesting as it moves on. That's the basic nature of any temporal art form, whether you go and listen to a symphony at the opera house, whether you go and watch a play at your local theatre, any art form that happens across time tends to work in this exact same way, that it gets more and more and more and more interesting until this climactic moment very close to the end. And then, of course, it needs to end very quickly after that, because that climactic moment is also a sort of cathartic moment at which all of the tension that the piece has been involved in constructing is released. And with that release, you allow your reader or audience to go and get on with their lives. So what I want you to do now is pause the video for a couple of minutes and have a think about where your story is going to start. The point at which your event is going to start proper, which means wrenching this event away from the timeline of life and realizing that it is literally connected to everything that has preceded it, right back to the Big Bang, but you can't tell the entire history of Earth or humankind every time you tell a story. So you've got to bring it forward right up until that last moment where you couldn't possibly have waited any longer, and that's when you're going to start. Now, for my story about the father getting into the drunken altercation, I plan to start this with the father and son. My idea is that the father and son are going to be decorating their house for grand final day, that somebody's going to wander past the house and the father's going to start into this altercation with them. So what I want to do is show, I want the altercation to interrupt what would otherwise have been a kind of pleasant and nice day. So I'm going to show the father and the son going to purchase the streamers that they need for this to happen, so that the reader gets a sense of the way the day should have panned out. And of course, the fact that it's a story means that it didn't quite pan out that way. So pause your video now, have a think about where your event starts, and when you've got a pretty good idea of where that is, turn your video back on and we'll continue on with the seminar. Alrighty, you've got your event now and you've got your starting place, and hopefully maybe you've even thought about the direction, the trajectory of this event and the way that it's going to increase with tension over the 500 words that I believe you guys are writing for this WestWords project. But even if it's a 3,000 word story, those principles remain the same. So now it's time to think a little bit more about character. Obviously this event is going to happen to someone, or somebody is going to be caught up in this event. And it may be the case that more than one character is caught up in this event. So we need to kind of be thinking about who the characters are that are pertinent to this event. Who are the characters that the event couldn't transpire without. This is how we're going to end up with our cast of characters. And for a short story of 500 words or even 3,000 words, you want a limited cast. There are some really exceptional writers out there who can work with a big cast of characters in a really short or small word count. And that's admirable. And I would say that it's probably a smarter decision for anyone who's just starting out with short story writing to be trying to keep things as small as possible rather than expanding them. This isn't a 19th century Russian novel with a cast of several dozen characters and a word count of 200,000. This is a really short story being written in 21st century Australia, presumably, and it's going to have a word count of less than 1,000. So one character would be fine. 2 characters would be ample. 3 characters would be pushing it. I'm not saying it's not doable, but you're really going to be pushing the limits of what you can get away with. So you've got your event, you've thought about where it begins, you've thought a little bit about shape. I want you to think now about who the characters are that need to be involved in this. Not the characters that you want to be involved in it or the characters that you think are interesting and have quirky personalities and like will offer something to the text that the reader might enjoy, but the ones for whom the piece couldn't happen without, the absolute elementary persons of this event, the ones that need to be there. I know I'm labouring a point here, but I find that this is an issue time and again for beginner writers, that they want to put too many characters in their stories and it gets unwieldy and it just causes problems. So once you've thought about that, you're also then going to need to think about who the most important of these characters is. If you've only got one character, it's pretty obvious. But if you've got 3 characters, then you're going to need to establish a little bit of a hierarchy here and determine who it is that this story is most important to. And it may be the case with the event that you've come up with that there are 2 characters for whom this event is equally important. And if this were real life, I wouldn't be asking you to distinguish or establish any kind of hierarchy there. It's totally possible that 2 characters experience something with equal profundity. But for the sake of writing a short story, you need to make some decisions, some hard decisions quite often. And your job as the author is going to be to go, all right, well, look, this character's perspective is really interesting, but on this occasion, this is the character that I care most about, or this is the character that I'm most interested in hearing from, or most interested in following through this saga. And they're going to be your protagonist. And they're going to be the character your reader extends their sympathies, empathies toward, the character whose eyes your reader tends to see the event through. Even if this is going to be a third-person narrator, your reader is likely going to align their sensibility with one of the characters in the story. The character is a sort of avatar for the reader, right? So who is it that you want your reader to be standing beside right throughout this event? This is your protagonist. And it doesn't hurt if this protagonist has a bit of depth about them as a character, which is to say that there should be the version of themselves that they present to the world, the conscious version of themselves, but maybe there's this other version lurking under there as well who thinks they understand everything about themselves and about the situation they're caught up in. But ultimately, the event is going to reveal something to this character that they themselves had not expected. So, maybe you don't need to be thinking about that at the early stages, but that's going to play out across the story over the duration of the story. The character is going to develop, and that development usually means becoming more aware of themselves as the reader becomes more aware of who they really are. This is what we refer to when we talk about character. This is what character actually is. Even in life, if you say somebody has character, you're talking about the essential them that's lurking inside, that tends to only come out in times of difficulty and crisis. You get a real sense of who somebody is. So that's what your event is ultimately going to bring to the fore. So who is your protagonist? In my work, I'm basically going to be working with a cast of 3. You already know 2 of them. One of them is the boy, the young boy. The other one is the dad, who's going to act like a bit of a jerk. And then I also want to have the character of the mum in there, because I think the mum is a nice counterweight to the father figure. You've got the boy sort of sitting in the middle, and over here you've got dad behaving poorly, and over here you've got mum trying to keep things from escalating and getting out of control. So there's a nice natural tension there. There's a bit of a tug of war going on in my story, and that maybe that would work for your event as well. I don't know. That's going to be for you to decide. So what I want you to do now is pause the video and spend some time thinking about who your cast of characters are and who the most important character is. For me, the most important character is actually the boy. And this is interesting because the boy is not going to be the one doing the most acting. The father is going to be the most active figure within the story. But really, my story is about the boy coming to some kind of realization about his father, some veil being lifted, which happens, as you grow, as you move from childhood closer to adulthood. You become hopefully a less naive figure, and you start seeing things in new kinds of ways. And that's what this story that I'm writing is about. So what is the story you're writing about, and who is the best character to tell that story? Pause the video and then let's meet back here. Okay, now it's time to think about setting. Your story has to happen somewhere. And now setting happens, when I'm talking about setting, I'm sort of talking about two things. I'm talking about physical location, and I'm also talking about the temporal dimension. So temporal dimension means thinking about the period in which the story happens. Does it happen now? Does it happen 100 years from now? Does it happen 100 years in the past? That's going to be an important consideration. And it also accounts for the duration of the story. Over how long a period of time does this story take place? Now, just like the cast of characters where I advised you to limit your cast and to not let it get out of control, the same rule roughly applies here for setting. For a short story, it makes sense that you limit your setting, that you have a story that takes place potentially over a couple of minutes is fine. That's how long my story is going to take place over. It's just going to last for a few minutes in time. Yours could last for longer, but I wouldn't go too far. A story that lasts or crosses over hundreds of years is going to be difficult to write in so short a space. And likewise for the physical dimensions, perhaps think about yourself less as a film director here and more as a theatre director building sets. So you'll know the difference when you're making a film, you're shooting in hundreds of locations potentially, and you're stitching all of these things together, and they go together quite seamlessly because of the nature of the medium. However, when you're putting on a stage play, perhaps you only have one set or a couple of sets. You might have a change midway through or something, but most of the action is taking place within a really confined, well-defined space, often just a room. And that's probably a good model to follow for a short story. Try to limit it in this instance as the beginner writers that I take you to be. Try to limit your setting to a few minutes in time, in a definable period of time that you feel comfortable writing in. If you're writing 50 years ago, you're going to need to do a lot of research. If you're writing now, probably can draw on your own experience more. And in terms of space, try to limit that as well. Maybe it just takes place in the one spot, in a cafe or a train carriage or at a football oval or at the front of a house, like my story is going to take place. And within that space, of course, you can start demarcating or breaking up that space. Like my story is going to happen at the front of the house, right? I want this father and son to be decorating the house. I want the father to get in an argument with someone who happens to be passing by. And I like the idea that the space where the father and son are located, the veranda, is kind of this in-between space. Down there on the road is the real danger zone where things are going to escalate. That's where the antagonist is waiting to sort of have it out with the father. And inside of the house is the opposite to that. It's this safe zone. That's mum's zone in this story. And if we can get the father in there, we know the situation has been resolved and we don't need to worry anymore. So we're oscillating between these two poles. And yet at the same time, it's all happening in just one closed location, the veranda of the house. So same deal as before. Pause your video now and think carefully about where your story takes place, when it takes place, and over how long a period does it take place. And my strong advice to you on this front is that you try to be as economical with all of those decisions as possible. All right, so we reach perspective. Now, perspective is really important and it needs to be determined before you can put any words on the page, because it ultimately relates to who's telling your story, who your narrator is. And as soon as you put words on the page, that narrator starts announcing themselves. So, for example, some of the early decisions you're going to need to make are things like, is your narrator a character within the story world? Are they caught up in the event that you're writing about? Or do they sit somewhere outside of that world with perhaps a slightly removed point of view, where they're not as emotionally invested in the event as somebody living it would necessarily be? So there are no right or wrong answers here, but every time you make a decision, this is going to affect the story in a really profound kind of way. If your narrator is somebody caught up in the story, like I said, they're bound to have a stronger emotional attachment to the story, and they're probably also less likely to be as fully aware of everything that's happening as an omniscient narrator who's sitting outside of the story world and can see everything. And that lack of knowledge, that naivety is going to play out in the way they recount the events, and their own personal biases and things are going to come into it. You know, if my story was being narrated by the father figure, for example, he's going to have a very different take on this drunken altercation than if it's being narrated by the boy. The father figure is likely to want to make himself look less culpable, whereas the boy maybe that's not the case. A young boy is a sort of naive figure who might not be able to read the situation entirely accurately. So some of that naivety is going to come through in the voice. You're also going to need to think about just basic formal things like tense. Is this a narrator who's telling the story as it's happening in real time and you're using the present tense? Or do you have the benefit of hindsight and you're revisiting the event 5 years from now and are able to look back on it and piece things together and understand aspects that weren't entirely evident or obvious at the time? All of that stuff is for you to decide. And like I said, there are no hard and fast rules about what does and doesn't work. Every single combination has been tried at some point in time, and every single combination has been made to work at some point in time. So your job really now is to think about, I suppose, to think about the way you want your reader to feel about this event and to feel about your character. How closely or how close to the story do you want your reader to be? How close to your character do you want your reader to be? First person present tense is going to put them incredibly close to the character. Third person past tense is going to push them out a little bit. A second person point of view in which you're using you a lot, you go to the kitchen, you get a drink, you turn around, you see the intruder in the house, is going to really place the reader inside the story. So those kinds of decisions have a big impact. Also things like the reliability of the narrator, how much we can trust this narrator. What I'm going to do with my story is I'm going to have it narrated by the boy character, but I'm going to have it narrated some years after the event. And I like this because this is a schema I use quite often, a device that I find myself returning to, writing about kind of childhood events with the advantage of telling it in the past. Because I feel that what it does for me is it allows me to put the boy character in the story as this quite naive figure who's not really understanding everything that's going on, who's trying to make sense of an adult issue, even though he doesn't have the facilities to do that. So I get that, but I also get the narrator who's the boy several years later, who's had some processing time, and there's an ironic distance between those two figures that I find really interesting. And I think it also gives the reader a nice spot to sit, because the reader is the one who is ultimately bringing these two figures together. The reader is the one who is bridging the gap between naive boy and less naive narrator. So pause the video and think about the best narrator for your story. If it helps you, if you're struggling, then go to your bookshelf and pick up half a dozen books and read the opening lines. And I don't know, just see which one grabs your attention the most effectively, and that's the one. Maybe there's a clue in that about what you like or what you're naturally drawn to in terms of point of view and tense. And then once you've made your decision there, come back, and there's sort of one more activity that I'll ask you to do. Okay, so the final activity relates to voice. And when I talk about voice, I'm talking about the way in which your character uses language. How emotionally charged is that language? How poetic is that language? How descriptive is it? How rich with metaphor is it? How esoteric is it? How colloquial is it? All of these things, this is actually what I find one of the most enjoyable parts about writing. It's about establishing a voice. It's about bringing a character or bringing a persona or a consciousness to life through word choice, through the kinds of language, the kinds of vocabulary that your narrator embodies. So what you're going to be doing now is playing around with voice, which means writing lots and lots of opening lines, opening paragraphs, until you find the one that really grabs you and you go, oh yeah, this is, I've got an entity on my hands here. I can turn this into a story. There's no other way that I know of for getting it right. There's no foolproof way of nailing the voice other than trial and error. I suppose a couple of bits of advice that I would have for you would be thinking about the relationship between the narrator, even if this is a third-person narrator who's outside the story world. I'd be thinking about their relationship to the story world. Usually what I'm trying to do when I write stories is find a voice that I feel complements the world that my characters are walking around in. Sometimes it's easy because the narrator is one of the characters, and it's very natural for me to put words in their mouth, in their heads. That comes across without a whole lot of effort. Other times I'm using a third-person narrator who technically isn't any of the characters in the story, and they don't technically live in the same story world, but it makes sense to me for the most part that they speak a similar kind of language to the people who do walk around in that world, that they share a parlance with the characters of my story. And this can be right down to things like the sorts of how likely they are to use coarse language, for example, and the kind of coarse language that the narrator might be likely to use. They're things that I'm thinking about as I'm shaping voice. And I don't know, it's really difficult to come up with voice. I think you've probably had this experience in life where some people start talking and you're just drawn to them. And it's not necessarily what they're saying. It's just that they are incredibly interesting to listen to. There are certain people that I could sort of listen to them talk about, paint drying on walls, and I would find it interesting. There's just something about the way that they use language. And if you happen to know one of those people, then you can steal their idiosyncrasies and turn them into a narrator in your story. If you don't know one of them, then you're going to have to, like I said, invent them through trial and error. It's just about trying lots and lots of different combinations until you get one that you're happy with. So what I'm going to ask you to do in order to kind of close this seminar down is to finish off by spending some time writing out some opening sentences for your story. I would say that writing a dozen opening sentences is not a tall ask here. That's probably pretty standard, at least in my practice, for finding the right mood, the right tone, the right perspective and voice for bringing it together. So I've developed this metaphor over the years for thinking about this opening sentence, and I like to think of it as like, imagine you're making a jigsaw puzzle, and when you start making a jigsaw puzzle, everybody starts in the same way. You go looking for a corner piece because it's easy. You know it can only possibly belong in one of 4 places, right? And if you've got the picture of the picture of the way the puzzle's meant to end up, then usually pretty obvious that it only can belong in one of those 4 places. So you're looking for an opening sentence that is a little bit like a corner piece to a jigsaw puzzle, which is to say an opening sentence that you can begin building off quite systematically. If you begin with, look, I'll give you a couple of examples for my story. The line the story actually begins with is this: my dad woke me early to go downtown and buy streamers. Now, compare that to something like this: I could never have predicted the events that would unfold on that fateful day. Now, that second example is kind of quite literary, I suppose. You definitely know that you're about to hear a story, but in terms, as a jigsaw puzzle piece, it sucks. What am I meant to connect that to? It's far too general, far too broad, far too opaque to really make any sense of whatsoever. I'm not able to find anything that I can connect to. Whereas, have another listen to the one that I actually use. My dad woke me early to go downtown and buy streamers. Already the key event in my story has already begun, whether the reader knows it or not. We're going down to buy the streamers, which is part of the decorating the house, which is part of the father getting into a fight at the front of the house. So there's an event side to this jigsaw puzzle piece that I could start building on as a writer, and as the reader is even perhaps unconsciously going to be building on as they make their way through the rest of the paragraph. 2 of my 3 characters are already present here. The dad and, well, we don't know that the child's a boy yet, but we at least know it's a child, presumably. So I've only got 3 characters in my story, really, and 2 of them are here in the opening sentence. So I think that's pretty good. That means that my next sentence could possibly build on that. There's a sense of place. We don't know about the veranda yet, which is sort of the key zone. But we've got an opening shot. We know that we're in a town, at least. And from the town, I can shrink down to the house. Then I can shrink down to the veranda. Then I can shrink down to this spot on the veranda where they're wrapping crepe paper around one of the poles. So there's a sense of place. There's obviously a sense of perspective. It's being told in the first person and past tense. And there's also, I think, a sense of voice happening there as well. If I had started by saying, my father roused me early so that we might venture into town to buy streamers, I've really only changed 2 words there, 3 words: father for dad, roused for woke, and venture for go. But we've got a really different kind of narrator on our hands and probably going to have a really different kind of story on our hands. So the voice is sort of present. I think it's quite an informal and accessible voice. My dad woke me early to go downtown and buy streamers. There's nothing particularly fancy or poetic about the writing there, and that is by design. These are not poetic characters, and this is not a poetic world in which not a classically poetic world, or not a romantic world anyway, in which they occupy. So I'm eschewing that kind of language. So for my money, that's an opening sentence that sort of works because, like I said, it's a good corner piece for a jigsaw puzzle. When it comes to writing my next sentence, I've already got a number of different things that I can build on. I could say something else about the characters. I could say something else about the setting, or I could develop the scene. I could say something else, the event rather. I could say something else, or develop that, advance that towards the conflict that's yet to come. So hopefully you can see that that's something that wouldn't be as easy to do with that other example. I could never have predicted the events that would unfold that fateful day. That's almost like a sentence that's sort of waiting, it's like a pre-sentence. It doesn't really feel like it's part of the story. It feels like a sentence that's saying, I'm about to tell you a story. So that's what that's what I would advise you to try to avoid. I would advise you to try to get straight into the story. So hopefully in thinking about these 5 aspects, event, character, setting, perspective and voice, I've given you some food for thought, and you should have sitting in front of you the beginnings of a story that hopefully won't take you too long to write. But what I want you to do now is, to say goodbye and go away and spend however long it takes until you get that opening sentence that says, this is the one that's going to drag you into the story. And then just go for it. Do whatever you can to get that story out on the page. And, then there's the whole process of working it over and making it better. But really what you're aiming for at this stage is to turn those 5 elements into something that looks like a story. So good luck with it, and I hope this has been helpful. Thanks. Bye.